Toronto's renoviction bylaws are now in effect. The new rules aim to protect tenants from, quote, bad faith renovation evictions at the municipal level.
With the absence of both the federal and the provincial government taking action, we're stepping up.
That, of course, is Toronto's Mayor, Olivia Chow. And under the new rules, landlords will have to apply for a license within a week of giving a tenant an N13 eviction notice for renovations. They'll also have to compensate tenants for moving and other costly accommodations. So here to break down the bylaws is Benjamin Rees. He's the Executive Director of South Etobicoke Community Legal Services. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, many tenant advocacy groups have been waiting for something like this for a long time. How does this bylaw change things in favor of tenants, first of all?
Well, in the province of Ontario for several decades, when a landlord says that they want to evict a tenant temporarily to do extensive renovation or repair work that needs the unit to be vacant, they apply to the Landlord-Tenant Board. They pay the tenant a compensation payment of 1 or 3 months' rent, and that's it. The tenant moves out, and they have the right to move back in theory, when the work is done, but too often that right isn't respected or enforced. So this is the city stepping in and requiring the landlord to go through an additional step that convinces the city that vacant possession really is required, provides the tenant with quite a bit more of really the cost of moving out. So a rent gap payment between their existing rent and what they'd have to pay on the private market.
I'm going to put up that board again because there's a few things, and they're very costly for landlords, or at least they could be prohibited. So you've got the $700 application fee, up to $2,500 one-time moving fee, depending on the size of the apartment that you have to temporarily move to. So that's covered by the landlord. And then possible rent gap payments. Can you explain that number?
Yeah, so the city is using the average of all rents for that type of unit or that size of unit between 2015 and now. So it's not quite going to come up to what the tenant is likely to have to pay for the time that they're out of the unit. But, you know, these are all expenses that until now have had to be borne entirely by the tenant.
Yeah. I'm curious why rent control wasn't an option for the city, rather than go through all of this process.
Yeah. I'd be curious as well. I mean, it's not really within the city's power to impose rent control, but it would be a much more straightforward solution for the province.
Yeah, what are some of the concerns about these new rules?
Well, for one thing, the city doesn't have a great way of establishing or really being certain that vacant possession is required. Now, that's going to depend on what a tenant can live with, right, in terms of the work going on in their unit. Right now, the bylaw requires the landlord to just get the sign-off of an engineer or an architect. So that's a little bit more than what we've had, but time will tell whether that ends up being closer to a rubber stamp or something meaningful that landlords have to obtain.
Okay, from a tenant perspective, let's say, you know, you get this notice that we're going to be renovating, you got to move for a couple of months, and then, as typically what happens, when you come back, there's a higher they've jacked up the rent based on the renovations that have been done. What does a tenant now do in that situation?
Well, under the existing legislation, the tenant, if they move back in, has the right to go back in at their old rent. That's why, unfortunately, some landlords have instead tried to get a new tenant in at a much higher rent. So the current bylaw is that's been brought into effect by the city keeps tenants informed. It has a registry where tenants can track the progress of the renovation work and imposes pretty significant fines on landlords who don't ultimately allow the tenant to move back in.
Okay, but let me ask you about the process of justice in this case. We know there are lots of stories of that. This can take a year to hear things at the landlord-tenant hearings. So what can a tenant do if the landlord just refuses to comply with the bylaws?
Well, the tenant can stay put, for one thing. Tenants have the ability to seek legal advice from their local community legal clinic, something we'd encourage. And if a landlord doesn't fulfill the requirements under this bylaw, then they shouldn't be able to succeed at the Landlord and Tenant Board. As long as the tenant stays put, learns about their rights, you know, that's the best protection they have.
What precautions should tenants still take, even with the bylaws in place as of today?
Well, tenants are going to want to get informed about the type of work that the landlord is proposing. So landlords under this bylaw are required to provide tenants with an information package. If it's the kind of work that the tenant might be able to live with, that might be more convenient for both sides. So depending on your relationship with your landlord, you may be able to discuss, you know, moving some of your stuff around and trying to accommodate a process where you don't actually have to move out. Because even with the landlord providing some compensation, it's still incredibly disruptive and uncertain for tenants how long they're going to have to be out.
Just before you go, Benjamin, clearing up on one point, is it up to the landlord to find the new space for the tenant to move to, or can the tenant find a space of their choosing and then the landlord has to pay the difference?
So the bylaw allows landlords to propose alternative accommodations, but they have to be acceptable to the tenant. If they're not, then the only other option is for landlords to pay that rent gap payment for as long as the tenant is out.
It's quite a change to the real estate landscape in this city. All right, Benjamin, great to have you here this morning. Thanks so much for coming. If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.